Hello to my extended family all over the world. My name is Mark Howard. Some of you know me, some of you don't. Some of you have met me before, but some of you may know my mother, Edna Howard. She left Belize in 1966. She married my father, Douglas, who at the time was a British serving soldier. This vlog request is for information about our family, going back as far as we possibly can.
The Kingdom of Asante once ruled supreme in West Africa. It was a kingdom that became an empire. It played a pivotal role in commerce linking 3 continents, and it was built on slaves and gold.
This is just a selection of the Asante crown jewels. It gives a real sense of the power and the sophistication of this kingdom.
Historian Mary Owusu is an expert in the Asante Kingdom.
Here it is. Luckily it's in color, you know.
It's truly spectacular. I know when one talks about kings and courts, you have a kind of certain idea of the extravagance and bright cloths and everything, and this fulfills all of that. And you can see, is this figure here?
That would be the Asante Hene, the king,
yes.
You see. And he has a lot more gold on him. And then the people. But that's also what power is about. It's about human beings, the number of people you control, as well as having the wealth to go with that control.
There's a real display of power, and I guess that the most significant sign of that is just how much gold is in evidence, just everywhere. It's pretty obvious looking at these, Mary, that they're trying to send a message. The Santini's right at the centre. The British who've come to visit, all of these different subjects,
There's
musicians.
something you are seeing but not seeing properly.
What aren't I seeing?
See these people here?
Yes.
They're holding skulls, human skulls of important individuals who have been overpowered, to show how much control the king had.
This illustration shows a wealthy state with an uncompromising grip on the kingdom. Fascinating though the account is, Bowditch only really got a snapshot of the Asante. And it doesn't reflect one of the most remarkable things about this kingdom, how it came into being in the first place. Asante emerged a little over 300 years ago in territory now occupied by the Republic of Ghana, in the heart of West Africa's forest zone. Dense forest is an unusual place for large civilizations to establish. The heat and humidity are relentless.
Despite the conditions, a complex and sophisticated kingdom emerged here that dominated a vast area for more than 200 years.
The vegetation seems so impenetrable that the scale of the achievement is hard to comprehend. Discovering how they did it and where they started has preoccupied historians for decades. In 2010, archaeology carried out by the University of Ghana made some important new discoveries about ancient life in this part of Africa.
These are 5 clay figurines we recovered from a site in northern Ghana, dating to the 9th and 10th centuries.
Dr. Benjamin Kankpian and his colleagues found some 80 terracotta figures, perhaps 1,000 years old, in Savannah north of the forest, depicting animals and humans. He believes they were part of a shrine.
What this points to is a very complex culture. I mean, even if you look at these as depictions of the world that surrounded the people who made them, that you can see that they're wearing jewelry, body adornment.
Exactly.
That this is obviously a very, very complex culture.
Yeah, for sure. As far as we know, one of the markers of civilized society are ritual complexity, possibly marked by these artistic figures, quality ones as well.
The figurines indicate sophistication among the peoples who lived in this region of West Africa. During the peak of the forest clearance 500 years ago, the Akan used axes to weaken the trunks and then pulled the trees down with twine.
Clearing the forest was a vital precondition for settled society. Before that, Akan people were part of a hunter-gatherer society. With the forest cleared, agriculture could happen.
Only with the space to cultivate land and grow food crops could groups of Akan people expand their populations. Today, in a forest in the west of Ghana, machinery makes short work of ancient trees. Hardwood timber, such as mahogany and teak, is among Ghana's most important exports. Licensing regulations attempt to protect the environment, but there's an understanding among forestry workers that Ghana's history is worth safeguarding too.
The forest is important to the people, to the Akan. The forests are important, are they?
Yes, it means something to the people. We have some areas we don't enter. You name the place, maybe this is the place where Ashanti people come from. Yes. So the forest is very important to us.
A long-term project I'm currently working on is called The Journey Home. Now, everybody loves a good story, and they always want to know what happens in the end. But wouldn't it be amazing to find out what happened in the beginning?
Uche has just delivered a male child. Hey! Gods of our land! You've really shown me that you are not asleep. Your Highness, you have proven to be the lion that you are. Yes! Your lineage will rule this kingdom from generation unto generation.
I don't know what to say, only Mono. Oh. Nana, you are indeed a blessing to me.
no woman will do what you have done. Oh, thank you. Thank you. How is the mother? How is she?
She is sound. And your prince is also sound. Your Highness.
Yes.
I want to ask you for a favor. I want to ask for something.
What is it? Ask me anything. Anything.
I want the mother of the prince to be made royalty by marriage.
So?
Yes.
Oh, Beloku, get the Onowu, we'll go to her people and pay her dowry. Eh? Do anything, you are free.
Hey!
You are free.
Let me fetch your nose.
You are free.
Hey!
Oh! I have a son! I have a son! Ha! I have a son! I have a son! Oh, praise to the gods. Yes! Let's go!
As they walk, the steps are getting faster. Till they do Kamuga. Open your eyes, you see the steps are faster. Hear the cry, Kamuga.
Earlier in the year, I had a full mitochondrial DNA test. Now, the mitochondrial DNA only follows the female side of the family. So my mother, which is grandmother, her mother, and so on, until it gets back to an ancestral origin. Well, the data came back about 2-3 weeks ago, and as you can see, there's a huge amount of information on my DNA test. But what is conclusive within these results is that we came from Ghana, and we're part of a group of people called the Nzima. It is possible to see from this map of the slave trade dated 1650 to 1860 that the people of West Africa were being forcibly taken from Angola right the way up to Senegal. The Nzima and many other captured tribespeople will be transported to one of almost 40 coastal forts along the slave coast. In all probability, the majority of the Nzima will be taken to the fort at Apollonia until a ship was ready to transport them the perilous 6,800-kilometre voyage to the West Indies. If they survived this journey, they would be unloaded, washed, ready to be sold like any other commodity, and then transported to their final destination, which for us was Belize.
The story of slavery has been a missing chapter in Britain's history. What started as a simple trade grew into an enterprise that transformed 3 continents. For Africa, it brought depopulation and underdevelopment. To the Caribbean, it brought a burst of prosperity, followed by a century of poverty and decline. In Britain, we have ignored the imprint left on our land, yet the legacy of our slaving past is all around us. The elegance and gentility of our stately homes were founded on the brutality of plantation life. Our industrial might sprang from the manual labor of millions of slaves. Above all, in many of today's British families, the slave system created an unbreakable bond to a past when our nation traded in human cargo.
In the 1840s, there was a reporter of British companies who were involved in slave trade in West Africa. One of the companies involved was called Forster and Smith. The government set up Parliament set up a select committee to look into the activities of this company and another company. Now, on the select committee which looked into the activities of Forster and Smith sat somebody called Matthew Forster, who it's not difficult to see was actually very much connected with this company. Not only did he sit on the select committee, but he also drafted the report of the select committee, which you would not be surprised to know said that this company was not in any way involved with slavery or the slave trade in West Africa.
It would be decades before Britain's involvement with slave labour was completely suppressed. And in that time, the country would experience the emergence of racial attitudes which still pervade Britain today. In the 1700s, Georgian Britain had been transformed by the profits from the plantations. Before abolition, these great houses featured a common sight: the black servant. There were at least 10,000 in the homes of the rich. Africans were still enslaved in the Caribbean, yet in England, black and white servants were treated as equals.
In Britain, the situation was different from the plantation, because the idea of a freeborn Englishman who should not be subject to arbitrary cruelties was very alive in the 18th century. It may not have been alive in the colonies, but it was very much part of the notion of being an Englishman. And of course, black slaves in Britain benefited from that principle, if you like.
Here, wealth was the great divide. Money mattered, colour did not. Society frowned far more on mixing between different classes than between different races.
At all levels of society, there were voluntary associations between black people and white people. At the level of the aristocracy, for example, you have the famous case of Soubise, the servant of the Duchess of Queensberry, who was a man of great flamboyance, a youth of great flamboyance, very handsome. All the kitchen wenches wanted him. But he also had this relationship, which became a scandal at the time, with the Duchess. So he had to be sent to India. He was banished to India.
In this society, some black people became well-known figures in their own right. Francis Barber was brought from Jamaica at the age of 7 as a slave. When his owner died, he was passed to a new master, one of England's leading authors, Samuel Johnson.
Samuel Johnson's an interesting character because he was one of the finest, perhaps the finest mind of his time, and he had strong, strong feelings about race and slavery. He violently opposed it. He had in his household a young man named Francis Barber who lived with him for 34 years.
Barber became settled enough to marry and start a family line, which still survives.
Francis Barber's son was Samuel. Samuel's son was Isaac. Isaac's son was Enoch. Enoch's son was William Edward. William Edward's son was Albert. And I, Dennis, is Albert's son.
Francis Barber would be intrigued to see how white his descendants have become. In his day, the difference between black and white hardly mattered.
I think that Sam Johnson looked on Francis Barber as being his son. The relationship, to stay with him for 35 years. And it must have cost him quite a lot of money to educate him as well. And as well to keep him. So I think there was a very, very strong relationship, more like father and son.
Even when Francis was away at school, Johnson wrote to him regularly.
Dear Francis, I am at last sat down to write to you, and thought very much to blame myself for having neglected you so long. Let me know what English books you read. You can never be wise unless you love reading. Do not imagine that I shall forget you or forsake you. Yours affectionately, Samuel Johnson.
On his return to the household, Francis became Johnson's manservant and constant companion, befriended by London's literary elite.
Of course, when you have someone like Francis Barber in the household who's well known to all of Johnson's friends, that person who's going to have contact with Johnson's friends as well. So Boswell, when he is writing the biography of Johnson, of course trailing him around and taking all his famous notes, becomes someone who knows Francis Barber, and he referred to him as, I think, Gentle Frank or Dear Frank.
Dear Frank, some of your old master's friends have thought that your opening a little shop for a few books and stationery wares in Lichfield might be a good thing. I hope you may consult and consider of it. I am, sir, your sincere friend, James Boswell.
At the end of Johnson's life, he did an unprecedented thing, which was to leave him his literary estate and quite a bit of money. This had been warned against by some of Johnson's friends, but he felt very strongly that Frank was the closest thing he would have to family. I don't want to exaggerate that because he doesn't think of Frank really as being family, but he is the closest thing to family, and he feels very strongly that Frank should be supported for the rest of his life.
In the name of God, amen. I, Samuel Johnson, being in full possession of my faculties, do ordain this my last will, and as to the aforesaid sums of money and property, together with my books, plate, and household furniture, I leave to the use of Francis Barber, my manservant, a Negro.
Using the money that Johnson had left him, Barber moved back to Lichfield with his wife, an Englishwoman called Betsy, and their children. He died in 1801. His family have lived in the same area ever since.
As far as colour-wise, I have never been embarrassed by... I am a descendant from Francis Barber. I've always classed myself as being English. And I would have thought that Francis Barber, being educated and in this country for most of his life, would consider himself to be an Englishman.
Francis Barber lived the life of an English gentleman, yet by the time Dennis was born, his own family was trying to paint their black ancestor out of the picture.
My mother didn't like to hear anybody talk about Francis Barber. My father always raised it and called him, always said Mr. Barber, and my mother always used to turn around and say, look, don't talk about that black man in front of the children.
His master's dictionary defined him as a Negro, but Barber probably never faced overt racial prejudice. Yet only a few decades after his death, black people had become objects of derision, contempt, and fear. The change in attitudes was rooted in the battle for abolition. The popular abolitionist movement made slaves the object of public sympathy. But the pro-slavery campaigners struck back, branding black people no better than animals. The slave traders lost the battle, but they started the first widespread campaign against black people in England.
When racism as such, as a philosophy, kicked in, was as a direct reaction to the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement driven by some of the leading intellectuals of the day, as well as driven by hundreds of thousands of ordinary people in this kingdom who signed petitions after petitions and presented them to the House of Lords. When the abolition movement really kicked in from the 1780s onwards, the planters had to respond. And so this is where you get the most virulent imagery about brutal, pagan, bestial black people in the literature and in the imagery.
Cartoons portraying black people as licentious and depraved began to circulate. The anti-abolitionist Edward Long wrote,
"The lower-class women in England are remarkably fond of the blacks. In the course of a few generations more, the English blood will become so contaminated with this mixture as even to reach the middle and then the higher orders of the people. This is a venomous and dangerous ulcer that threatens to disperse its malignancy far and wide until every family catches infection from it."
The Times and other magazines, reviewing a London performance by the black actor Ira Aldridge, could barely contain their distaste.
The features of this genuine nigger possess much of the African character, but are considerably humanized. Owing to the shape of his lips, it is utterly impossible for him to pronounce in English.
It is impossible that Mr. Aldridge should fully comprehend even the meaning of the words he utters. In the name of common sense, we enter our protest against a repetition of this outrage. In the interests of decency, we protest against a ladylike girl like Miss Ellen Tree being subjected to the indignity of being pawed about by this black servant.
Until the 1840s, these racial attitudes had little impact in Britain. But the advent of colonialism would turn them into opinions held in every quarter of Victorian England.
The moment the slave trade ended, colonialism began. The flags were planted here. And the Germans and the French and the British were roaming all over here. And they were firing on each other out of the various forts and so on. Across the entire continent, all the way down to the Cape.
British colonists breathed fresh life into old stereotypes to justify their occupation of Africa.
When the next phase came in, which was really the imperialist phase, when Africa was partitioned, you had to have justifications in the 19th century for really theft, for really walking into people's country, shooting them, and taking whatever it is that they had.
The colonial adventurers were given a further spurious defence by a new British passion, science. Some races were, they said, born to rule.
If you believed, and you'd been told by highly reputable scientists, Charles Darwin's cousin no less, that Africans were on a totally separate stem of humanity and were simply on a lower rung, then it's very hard for anybody to accept equality. And that attitude was astonishingly pervasive. It was an automatic response to see these people as less than human. To identify somebody as different was almost automatically to judge them as worse. And that really was the beginning of the idea of scientific racism.
By the second half of the 19th century, racial attitudes had changed radically. This was reflected in popular fiction. In Vanity Fair, Rhoda Schwartz, a mulatto, is described as clumsy and socially inept, wearing diamonds as big as pigeon eggs. The Victorians felt a particular revulsion for people of mixed race.
They begin to make their way into the fiction in very oblique and obscure ways. They become the mysterious stranger from abroad who has a secret, perhaps a genetic secret. So when you get a novel like Jane Eyre, in which she is trying to become the real owner, the real wife of Rochester, and you find that he's got a wife who has got a problem.
Edward Rochester, wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife?
1 moment, please. I declare the existence of an impediment. Proceed with the ceremony. You cannot proceed. Mr. Rochester has a wife, now living. Who are you? My name is Briggs. I am an attorney. Mr. Mason, on the 20th of October, 1824, Edward Rochester of Thornfield Hall was married to Bertha Mason at St. Mary's Church, Spanish Town, Jamaica. The record of the marriage will be found in the register of that church.
Parson, close your book. There'll be no wedding today.
You begin to realize as you read back that she has most likely got a racial identity that he finds insupportable. This won't do. So you've got a woman in the attic who has come from the West Indies, and she has to be burned up at the end of the book in order for Jane to become the real wife.
That gentleman is my wife. Mad, and the offspring of a mad family.
So you begin to see in the Victorian period a lot of fear of black people who have a slave background infiltrating their way into the Victorian world. And it's a great terror to many people to think that it's not out there somewhere. It's back here in the house. It's in your wife. It's in your attic.
The Victorians devised a racial hierarchy designed to emphasize the separateness of black people. The shadow of this 19th century prejudice still falls across British life. The Victorians' theory was based on biological distinctions between Africans and Europeans. They were partially right. We now know that there are small genetic differences between races. Modern science is finding that some racial characteristics can turn up in unexpected places.
Races, generally speaking, are of course defined by genes. A very small sample of genes, skin colour, hair colour, the shape of the nose and so on. So genetics and race are close together. But we now know that we can be much more specific than that. There are certain genes which are pretty characteristic of certain parts of the world. For instance, in Africa, there are particular genes which, until the world began to mix up, as far as we know, were only found in Africa. The famous one is the gene for sickle cell anemia, which is a protective blood variant that protects against malaria. People who came from West Africa have been moved, often against their will, to different parts of the world. And as a result, the sickle cell gene, with many others, moved with them. That means that if there has been any mating between Africans and non-Africans, that gene will persist, and as a result there are probably thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who think of themselves as white, and indeed have white skins in the world, who are carriers of the sickle cell gene. They have an African ancestor somewhere.
Science can now lead us to the descendants of slaves. Most of them know nothing of their hidden heritage. Jane Pryor lives in Brighton. Until one morning in 1997, she had no idea that there was anything unusual in her family history.
I've been a blood donor since 1994 and give blood regularly about 3 times a year. And in 1997 I received a letter from the National Blood Transfusion Service, totally out of the blue, saying they tested my blood and found a sickle cell trait. The first thing I did when I found out was telephone my mother and said, well, it must come from you. I don't think, because of the way we understood our family line, the first person I thought of was my mother, as opposed to my father, and asked my mother to go and get tested, which she did. And he went to the hospital and had blood
I
test.
had it too. So,
but it is genetic, so it had to come from one of my parents.
It's got to come through the family. And the only family that have mentioned it is my mother's side. So you've got to go back then to the grandparents. But from there, only by talk, by word, they think it's back through my mother's side, and her mother, and her mother. So it starts here with you and Neil.
Mm-hmm. And
then it comes up to me and my sisters. And my mother and father. And that's my mother, your grandmother, as she went to be training to be a nurse. And that's a father. There. That's Eva and Bill, and their mother and father was...
Jane will never suffer sickle cell anemia.
Richards.
Both parents have to pass on the genetic trait for the disease to develop. That's why only black children are generally thought to be at risk. But Jane's random test suggests otherwise.
And then her parents...
Looking through the family tree, Val recalled that one of their ancestors was said to be a sailor who came from Jamaica in the 1700s.
In the census.
The sickle cell trait confirms the family legend.
But also in the census with John Brown is another John Brown in the same area who could have been his father.
It was very much treated as confirmation of the way the family line was going, and the digging into the past. That was more or less the icing on the cake.
I thought it was exciting. I thought it was great. You finally put the full stop after the word. You know, it's made something definite. Everything before that was, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be something else. This underlined it more or less and said it is so.
Jane and Val now realise that they are one of many white families in Britain who are directly descended from slaves.
I don't think the people in England, I mean, I'm only talking from what I can see. The slave trade is something that's in a storyline. I don't think it hits deeply.
And also thinking there might be that history in our own family, it suddenly makes you think about it more and how it's had a knock-on effect to a lot more people than they probably realise or want to realise. and how it's affected history today.
Yeah.
If it hadn't have happened, then the history of this country would be totally different.
Oh,
it'd be different today.
Completely different. Well, if there hadn't been a slave trade, we wouldn't be here. No?
Exactly.
No, we wouldn't be here. No.
Jane and Val discovered their heritage by accident, but other British families have found new ways of identifying their slave ancestors. This remote part of Scotland's west coast has no obvious connection to the slave trade. But here in Dumfries there is a direct link to Britain's slaving past. In this quiet graveyard in the village of Whithorn, the headstones bear the names of families who have been here for generations. The name Jolly appears at least a dozen times.
The Jollies in this area have been here a long, long time. I mean, these can back as far as we can go back on them. You're talking about 200 years. So, I mean, many families can actually say they've been in one area for that amount of time.
In spite of their deep roots here, the Jollies still feel that they are different. They look white, but David believes he has a black ancestor.
I mean, the colour here is a trademark, and I mean, thank God it's growing out, because when you went in dances, when you were at the Skill and Art, I mean, you weren't made an example of, but you were always, there didn't seem to be that difference.
David feels haunted by a past that he cannot understand.
If you didn't want folk to ken you, you could get into a crowd and mingle in with the crowd, couldn't you? But if you're a Jolly, you couldn't do. No, if you had the curly head.
David believes that he can still see the evidence of an African ancestor even in his grandchildren.
It's got to come for a coloured place somewhere, somebody or colour for its only type of hair, only place you can find this type of hair. It's no for the white side of the family, is it? Really? I don't know.
David Jolly is now retired. His suspicion has been with him all his life, but he's never been able to prove it. Just 10 miles away from his home, there is a clue. It could resolve the puzzle that has dogged his family for generations. Here in Wigtonshire lies the family seat of the Maxwells, Lairds of Monreath. David's going to see a 200-year-old painting hanging in the house. It has a story that has been handed down through the family. David has arranged to meet Sir Michael Maxwell, the 9th Baronet, who could throw some light on the mystery.
Greetings, David. I'm Michael Maxwell.
Isn't it?
Very good to meet you. Come and have a look at this picture, and I'll tell you all I know about it.
Okay.
Come.
Thank you very much.
Come on in, David. Have a look at this. Picture. You've never seen this before, have you?
No.
What I know about it is that it was painted in 1765, and the man is my ancestor 7 generations back. He was a lawyer, and he's with his black page boy, who looks young. You know, it's difficult to say how old he is, but he could be 12, 13, 14.
I know a lot more.
No. But what is interesting is that the boy is very well dressed, beautifully dressed, and Maxwell is well dressed, and so he wouldn't have been, as we think of slaves, out in the fields. He would have been an indoor house servant. I've always heard that this is connected with your family. I suspect that he had a child, a daughter. He was married probably in one of the local villages. Your family probably came over from Ireland and married the daughter, who was half black. That is supposition, but I've always been told ever since I was a child that there was a connection with him and the Jolly family.
Jolly family,
but you know, we can't prove it either way.
No.
But I think it's very sweet. There weren't that many black slaves in Scotland, and that was why he was painted. You know, it was something different. We don't know where he came from. We don't know when he left, where he left. What is unfortunate is that our family records are fairly complete, but there's a gap at this time. I sent all the family papers to the Scottish Records Office, and they've searched through them, and they can find no trace of this. We've looked through the parish records, and there's no trace. There's a gap in the parish records. You know, they would have been burnt or destroyed or whatever. And so we'll never know exactly.
No, you can only go on with word of mouth.
We can go the word of mouth, and I just feel that the word of mouth has been so strong that something must be there.
Yeah. I mean, a story doesn't carry through a family. You'll always get bits added and bits taken away, but there's always plenty of stories. But there's never only a load of things to back it up. But this is something that
this is rather charming, though, isn't it?
And it doesn't seem to be. He seems quite happy.
Yeah, he's well dressed.
I can see a big.
There's a resemblance.
Aye, a resemblance, and that gives us a reason for our curly hair.
It does.
An explanation.
A strong gene is going through you.
In fact, that gentleman, you resemble him yourself, do you know?
Well, he's got more hair than me.
I would.
He's fat. Yes, I could resemble him. Possible.
In the face, you resemble him. No, I like this. Oh, there's a question has been answered. Seeing this, and the question has been answered. Sometimes I don't know. Maybe I accept things a wee bit too easy, but. Sometimes you're better. I think you're better to know, no matter what way you're going. You're better to know. If you know, at least you can answer. If you don't know, you can't answer. And the questions are in your head. There's just no words to explain it. I think if I wanted my curly hair, that's what I'd wanted to comfy. I feel like he's looking at me. I don't know what he'll be saying. I don't know what he'll be thinking. But there is a longing there in the eyes if you take a right close look over there. There's a longing there. No, I like it. I do. I like it.
David Jolly believes that he has finally found his African ancestor.
the reason for the project? Well, imagine reading a book knowing full well that someone had ripped out the first 300 pages. The story would be good, but it would be inconclusive. Imagine getting those 300 pages back and reading the book from the beginning. We've all got a great idea of where we want to be in life and where we're going. But wouldn't it be really great to know where we've come from? So what I'm looking for are stories and information about our grandmother, Miriam Griffith Pilgrim. Any kind of story that she may have told you about her childhood, or stories she may have told you about her mother, or if there's any information or documentation that exists out there that predates our grandmother's birth.